Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Julia Osmond. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities, and I'm very happy tonight to welcome you to our program for a Buddhist Perspective on 2020. I am joined by Dr. Alex Vessey and Mr. K. Mamiya, and I'm also very happy to say that this is not only an Institute for Humanities event, but a Holmes Cultural Diversity Center event that's part of their International Education Week. And so to tell us more about that and introduce our speaker, I'm going to things over to Kay. Kay, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kay Mamiya, and I'm an assistant director in the Homeless Cultural Diversity Center. I'm very excited to be here with my colleague, Dr. Osman, and then also Dr. Vessey, who is my undergraduate seminar professor from Japan. So as Dr. Osman said, this is part of the International Education Week at Mississippi State University. We usually do this during the third week of November because that's the International Education Week in the United States. But since our semester is ending early, we decided to do it this week. So basically, International Education Week is designed to provide opportunities for students from K-12 to college students or anyone really to learn about different cultures, different worldviews, and then engage in conversation around various topics that are important to our society internationally. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Vessey. Dr. Vessey is an associate professor of the Department of Global and Transcultural Studies at Meiji Gakuin University in Japan. He completed his PhD in East Asian Studies at Princeton University in 2003. And his primary research interest centers on the social history of Tokugawa-era Japanese Buddhism. He also teaches courses in global history and in media studies. Now, please join me in welcome Dr. Alexander Vessey.
Good evening. Evening for you. It's morning for me over here in Japan. I hope everybody is well. Is my voice clear?
I hear you very clearly.
Very good.
I understand that that after a few technical difficulties, my fault on Facebook. So thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Vessey.
No.
So Dr. Vessey, tell us a little bit more about yourself. So you teach Buddhism in Japan, but what exactly is your specialty, and does living in Japan help you study it?
Yes. As Kay pointed out, my interests are in the Tokugawa period, which is roughly from 1600 to 1868. That's a very sad date. And my interest is really the Buddhist clergy in rural contexts. When you read about Buddhism, you often hear or read about famous monks, etc., who influenced Buddhist philosophy, etc., but there's not as much emphasis on the life that was lived by priests outside those sorts of elite spheres. And so I'm sort of interested in Buddhism from the bottom up, and how clerics lived in village life, how they interacted with people, etc. Why the focus on villages? Well, in Tokugawa, Japan, 90% of the population lived in rural context, right? And so therefore, if you want to talk about the clergy, you need to think about them in that kind of environment. And in doing so, that allows us to think about just about Buddhist thoughts and practices, but also how Buddhism engaged the laity, what lay people thought about their Buddhist priests. There are lots of interactions, not all of them pleasant. A lot of the things I read about talk about, fights over one thing or another, but those sorts of fracturing also show us how society works. And so that's why I'm interested. I'm interested in priests who are not famous, who never made the big billboards, because I think there's a lot to be learned from their lives as much as from the more famous priests that we often read about. Right. I'm also interested, Kate mentioned media methods. I should explain that just briefly. I like taking pictures. This thing is a picture I took at a temple called Gansenji, which is outside of Nara in a little area called Tono. The temple was founded around 790 or so. The building that you can see right over here, there you go, that was built in 1442. It's an important cultural property. But anyway, I like taking pictures of Japan. And in response to your question, what's the benefit of being in Japan? Well, I get to walk around in places like this. The documents I read are often not available in Western libraries, etc. So for me, the things I want to study are here. So being here gives me access to that. And I will say, I live in an area which is close to the coast in the prefecture of Kanagawa. And there are roads that pilgrims used to take to this island. And as you walk along the roads, you'll find stone stele, which are like guideposts, etc. And these are also hundreds of years old. So no matter where you live in Japan, if someone's preserved it, you will encounter these little bits and pieces of Japan's past, some of which easily predate the founding of the United States. So that's, for me, part of the benefit of living here is what I study is here. And so I have access to it.
Okay, great. Wow. So you're talking about, or you were talking about these Buddhist priests. So what exactly, for just the simple layman like me, what exactly is Buddhism? Can you define the religion and tell us what it is?
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about how to go at this, and it's perhaps we should go about it this way. When we talk about religion and humanity's relationship with a particular belief system, some, not all, but some of them posit, an absolute existence and humans that are alienated from it, right? In the case of Christianity, there's original sin, right?
Right.
The apple, that was it. And so there's been this constant struggle of how do you get back to this absolute, right? Buddhism takes a very different take on that. Same sense of alienation, but a different take in that there is no absolute. There's only flux, change. Things come, things go. Rivers, trees, mountains, all the things we see in our earth, none of them exist forever. Even the universe eventually comes into being. Where it comes from, there are no creation stories in Buddhism. That's not what they're interested in. It's just that there's this constant change. And so the alienation part then is how do we live with that?
Right.
Because, well, we don't like change, right? In some ways, we don't like change, right? We would always like to be healthy, happy, etc. But that's not it. So the early Buddhism focused on, well, how do you deal with that flux? When it's inimical to what you would desire for yourself or for your others, right? We don't want to see our friends pass. We like to see our dogs with us forever, etc. But that's not the way it works. So how do we deal with that? That's where Buddhism begins. This is kind of encapsulated in the story that's usually used to teach Buddhism, which is the story of Siddhartha Gautama, who is the founder of Buddhism, if you will. According to legends, these were written several years after he passed, so you have to take them with a grain of salt. But according to the legends, he was a son of a local ruler, and upon his birth, there was a prophecy that either he would be a great ruler or a great religious teacher. And the father, wanting him to be a successor, raised him in this wonderful world, I guess kind of like this. Every need was met. Again, this is 500 years before the birth of Christ, so it's a very simple kind of environment compared to what we live in, but all the needs were provided for. Food was available. At that time, if you wanted to eat, you really had to struggle to eat. There was no struggle. So he is given all these benefits, but according to the stories, he sneaks out of the palace 3 times. And in each of these little jaunts into the real world, he encounters a diseased person, a person who's growing ill, and a dead body.
Right.
And that shakes him up, and he realizes that, I live in this kind of place, but ultimately that's not what's going to happen. And that creates his doubt. And so he, in his fourth little jaunt out from the palace, sees this wandering mendicant, and Indian religious traditions focus on these wandering religious seekers who have sort of cut social ties, and they spend their days traveling about, but also seeking, depending upon their particular belief system, access to reality, insights, etc. So he sees this and he says, well, I'm going to go follow that path. And so the stories are he sneaks out of the palace late at night with his faithful servant, his favorite horse, and then he says goodbye to them all. He's married at this time. He has a child.
Oh, wow.
He leaves them all. He takes off all of his kingly robes, and he puts on this robe that he sewed together, which is made from fragments of thrown away cloth, and off he goes. And for 6 years he trains. He, at one point, engages in extreme asceticism, almost dies of starvation. He realizes that imbalance is not good. If you push yourself one way too far this way, ultimately there's no stability there. And so the whole process is he's seeking stability. Okay, that allows you to deal with the flux without being afflicted by that realization. So, according to the stories, after 6 years, he is sitting under a tree in ancient India, and he sees this morning star. He has this awakening, and he has this insight into an absolute that goes beyond life, death, self-other, all these things that create distinctions. In other words, something that goes beyond the flux, if you will. Okay, and that's a state called nirvana, or in Sanskrit, or nibbana if you're in Southern Buddhism. And so then he begins this process of teaching for the next 40 years. So how do you attain this state of stability, of calm, of equanimity, if you will, or equanimity, that allows you to address anything that comes at you, because you're no longer afflicted by the fact that nothing you want is going to remain. And so you attain this sort of mental state of peace that allows you to deal with anything that comes at you, whatever changes happens. It doesn't bother you because you have this insight into how the world really works.
So, and I'm going to ask you a follow-up question if I may, but I'm also going to take this opportunity to just remind everyone who's listening out there that if you have a question for Dr. Vessey, please don't be shy. Just put it in the comments of Facebook, and we'll be sure to ask him for you. So just following up on that, what you were saying about obtaining, this kind of sense of peace, that you're at peace with the fact that everything's going to change, and you're at peace with the fact, of these things around you. So is this what helps people deal with suffering in Buddhism?
Yes.
Have you yourself someone, you actually personally know someone who has attained this? Have you attained this? Are you at peace with 2020 and everything that's been going on?
Going to your first question, yes. Again, according to the traditions, when the Buddha first started teaching, he presented this idea of the four truths. And this is in any textbook on Buddhism. So it's a fundamental element to all Buddhist variations of practice. And so the first truth is that life is suffering. Now, that doesn't mean that you're born, you suffer, and you die, and that's it. We have joyous moments in life. We enjoy being with friends. We have family, all those sorts of things. But the suffering part comes from the fact, again, that none of this is permanent.
Right.
It's all fleeting. And so what's the cause of the suffering? Well, the cause is from these certain desires that we have. Now, that sounds like Karate Kid kind of basics sort of thing. But it's this sense that we want to see continuities of some things. We don't want to encounter other things. We judge the world around us based upon a very self-centric vision of what we wish it would be, what it would not be, etc. But ultimately, and this is the thing that throws a lot of people off initially, is that Buddhism does not posit a soul. that exists forever.
Mm-hmm.
You have an existence now. I'm Alex Vessey. Okay, there's Kay, there's Julia Osmond. You're here, we're talking. But we come into existence and then we pass. And as my own, I was at a Zen monastery for 5 years, and as the abbot, who's called a Roshi in Japanese, would said, "Well, when you die, that's it." um, but,
Be at peace with that.
well, because that's something we don't want to accept, right? That's
Right.
it. What? Having said that, there are a couple of things that should be understood here at this point. That when I say that's it, some people would take this being merely nihilistic. Well, hey, if what we do doesn't count, then let's not care about anything anymore. Buddhism
Right.
response is that this life that you have now is so unique. Don't waste it. Okay, one. Two,
Right.
it's so unique. Don't take it from others. And the Buddhist precepts, the first one is, do not kill. In reality, there are various other circumstances, and we can talk about that here in just a little bit, if we get into an issue of morals. But fundamentally, life is unique. Make the most of it. Buddhism does have a sense, like other Indian religions, a belief in karma. Another is action. And again, this isn't any basic textbook, but karma is the sense that whatever actions you do have effects that will influence things in this life, but also, well, the term here that's often used is rebirth. And in Buddhism, it's a little more complicated because if there's no self, then what is reborn? And that's a matter of debate amongst Buddhists. But many Buddhist schools now feel that your actions, or more specifically, your intentions, what do you intend to do, creates these seeds of sort of karmic impulse of effect. And those seeds can be passed, I pass, I die, but my actions and my intentions create the seed that would be passed on to another life, or it would enter into another life that's created by, if it's a human, we all know where humans come from physically, same with other animals, right? So what you do affects another being. And so when you think about Buddhist causality, it's not just, what do I do to myself? Okay, I did something bad, I will suffer. No, it's more your actions influence another existence. So you really need to think about that, right? It's not just you living by yourself, but what do you do and how does it influence others? That's the key thing. And that's why intentionality is important. Sometimes we make mistakes and hurt others. That's not good, but there was no malice there. But if you do something out of malice, then the intentions create a lot of highly negative karmic influence. So we suffer then because of this self-centric vision that creates these karmic influences that not just affect affects other lives, affects those around us, etc. That's kind of the source of suffering in Buddhism. It's also the source. There's no sense of absolute evil. Rather, there's ignorance, and in our ignorance, we do things that causes others to suffer, causes ourselves to suffer. And so, the whole purpose of fundamental Buddhist training is how do you gain the wisdom to step away from yourself. You're still alive. Okay, I'm not denying yourself. You're not a robot. You're not the. I don't know if students now ever watch Star Trek Next Generation, but when I was your age,
I can't tell you.
When I was your age, Star Trek Next Generation, one of the most feared aliens was the Borg, because they're half human, half machine, and they don't think for themselves. They are just part of they're a hive mind, but there's no individuality. That's not what Buddhism's about. But the idea then is, do you have the wisdom to live with everybody, but not create these influences that negatively affect everybody? That's kind of I'll quickly wrap this up so we can go off other questions. But the third truth then was that there is a way out of this, okay? Through introspection, through self-reflection, through mental disciplining, etc. That it's not a belief system that's going to get you into heaven. You're not going to worry anymore about, am I going to heaven or hell? I'm not going to look at the world from my own personal point of view. And then the fourth truth was that the way you do this is what was called the Eightfold Noble Path. Again, that's in any textbook online. I won't take our time talking about all of those things because I think people could read about them elsewhere. But after Buddhism initially began in this part of India, then spread throughout India, then encountered other cultures in Central Asia, South Asia, China, Korea, Japan, the ways that you attain this state, they're all from the same basic core, but they've become culturally diverse. They've incorporated different elements from other cultures, etc. So Buddhism has a very wide range of practices that are all based upon this one central goal of how do you get beyond your self-centrism.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So I've got a great follow-up question for this. And this is one of the questions that one of our listeners is asking, she asks, so now that you've defined Buddhism so perfectly for us, she says, how has the Buddhist religion helped people in Japan deal with the stresses that have occurred during this pandemic? What could Western culture learn from this?
Okay. If I may, one other question you asked me, am I awakened? No, this is not the phase of awakening. Sorry. No. No one should ever think that. No. There's still lots of self-centrism here. When I trained in the monastery, the abbot is someone who is, according to the tradition, have attained that state.
Right.
It doesn't mean they would call themselves Buddha. No one calls themselves Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. They're just, an awakened human being who teaches others. So, now, give me to Lucy. That was her.
Yes, Lucy's question: how has the Buddhist religion helped people in Japan deal with the stresses that have occurred during this pandemic, and what could Western culture learn from this?
Okay. Well, in modern Japan now, if you ask many people, what is your religious faith? Most of them would say, well, I don't really have a religion. I don't belong to a religion. Many Japanese would, you can ask Kay about this, Kay and his associates, none of them said, my family may go to a Buddhist temple for funerals, but that's about the extent of how they think about it. Other people, though, do belong to a variety of religions. I mean, there are people who are ardent Buddhists, too. But throughout society as a whole, there are not many people who would sort of consciously say, I am a Buddhist and follow a Buddhist path. But this idea of stepping away from yourself, I think, while still living with everybody, has become an integral part of sort of Japanese social relations, even if in a sort of subconscious level, right? The sense that you think more about those around you. For example, from what I see in the news, this whole thing about masks, well, don't take my freedom, it's my right to choose. Okay. Asians, and this is not just true for Japan, but Taiwanese, Chinese, and Koreans, it's a medical issue. And so one wears masks not just for yourself, but for someone else. In fact, the science apparently says is that when you put on a mask, you might inhibit some of the viruses that are coming to you, but more importantly, if you are a carrier, you're not projecting it outwards to everybody. And so the masks, you wear the mask not just for yourself, but you wear it for other people, right? You wear it to prevent spread. And so, recently there was a news that in Taiwan, they haven't had a recorded transmission in 200 days. Japan, it does happen. I can't say that all Japanese wear their masks well, but I think that within Asian society, even if people are not consciously Buddhist, this sort of idea that you need to think more about those around you in that sense, right? Your sense of individual freedom is not based upon, do I have the right to choose this mask or not? That kind of thing. And so that's helped people to respond to it. It doesn't mean that people are not, anxious about it. I do know that students here can't come to college campuses easily, so that created all sorts of other angst, right? Ideally, I suppose everybody would meditate in their free time and they would overcome their problems. No, that's not happening. But I would think that those who do believe in Buddhism would use this time, to sort of think about these sorts of things, right? So the influence, I would say, is somewhat more indirect than one might think. Japan is not a Buddhist country in that sense. I mean, it's a part of the tradition, part of the culture, but people don't spend most people don't spend their days thinking about how do I live as a Buddhist. But these sorts of ideas are still now implicitly within the culture, that they still exert an influence on how people respond to something like this. And I will say, if I may, stepping aside from COVID, but if you look at like the to give a little bit other example, if you think about the tsunami that hit in 2011 in the northeastern part of Japan, that's a much more conservative part of Japan, and their Buddhist temples were really important because they were centers where people could flee to. Priests actually became they're not trained as psychologists, but they became listeners, right? People coming in, they've lost family, they've lost their livelihood, everything is in disarray. And many priests would then, take the time to listen to these complaints of people and try to help them work their way through, how do I adapt to all of this? They became negotiators in these moments of family strife, etc. And so in other parts of Japan, depending on the circumstances, people do rely upon Buddhist temples in daily life. And in those cases, you do see priests who are quite active and engaged in this. I know that you study, French society, and they created a system where priests would set up these sort of consultation areas, and they were called Café du Monk, right? Cafes of monks, right? But also, monk in Japanese means complaint. Different word, same sounds, right? So Café du Monk means, the place to bitch, right? But also means, a place to talk to the priests. Right. And so a witty combination of two different languages and concepts there to show how Buddhism can be quite engaged in helping people out with these sorts of things.
Right. Well, while you were explaining that, someone has asked a question that I think follows up really well from it. This is a question from Alexandria Taylor, and she says, "Hello, Dr. Vessey." She says, "Do Buddhists believe in a outside of leaving a good or helpful legacy? What leads a person to care about their legacy if there's no heaven or hell to worry about their actions affecting?"
Okay. I think we think about legacies. If you want to make a mark on the world, that's again a sort of desire for continuity, right? But when I was in America a long time ago, translating for the abbot of my monastery, people would ask, well, does Buddhism have any sense of morality? Well, it doesn't sound like it, right? But he always pointed out that if you truly are selfless, then you immediately empathize with other people. And so since the barriers, your own barriers between you and them have been whittled down, weakened, removed, then their suffering is something that you don't suffer physically necessarily, but you still perceive their suffering. And so a Buddhist who approaches the practice from that standpoint then would think, well, what do I do to alleviate others' suffering if they are suffering, right? So in that sense, a Buddhist would engage in activities, hopefully, that you're not doing it for yourself. Okay, I'm not doing something that's like donating a lot of money to get my name on a building. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. You're doing something to help others. Hopefully, lead a better life. Hopefully, if it's in a Buddhist environment, they also start to follow the Buddhist teachings, etc. And so there is a strong sense of nurturing, in the sense to help others also, alleviate their own suffering, if you will. And so that would be more of a guiding principle rather than, what is my legacy? Because again, it's still me that you're thinking about. No. That's not what you're supposed to think about. Ideally, you are supposed to, want to do things that help others also transcend their own problems and suffering. Now, that being said, we're talking about human beings. There are lots of people who donate to temples because they know that somewhere their name is going to get stuck on some wall. There are signboards, Kay will talk about this, in front of temples, shrines, of, how many people donated how much money. Yeah, in reality, the motivations are very complex. But if we're going to talk about the ideals, the ideal is that you don't do it for yourself, but you do it for others. Now, that also may create, good karma, good karmic effects. And if you even if you cannot train now in this world, hopefully you would be able to create the sorts of seeds that would allow you to allow the next life to be able to train and ultimately gain awakening. That's one process in all this. So the notion of karma, it's not the exact equivalent of say, Roman Catholicism's good deeds, but there's a certain parallel there in that you can create good effects that have other good effects later on.
Right. So that, and presumably if you feel the suffering, if you are like, oh, it's terrible to see this person be so sick or something, then if you cause less suffering around you, if you help other people, then you yourself feel less suffering, kind of as an indirect result.
That's right. Yes, that would be part of it. Yes.
All right. And I think, Kay, you've been trying to jump in now for a little while. Kay, you have a question, I think, don't you?
Yes, I had a kind of follow-up questions about what Dr. Vessey already mentioned, but I think the difference between, let's say, Buddhism and other religions, but for me, based on my experience, coming from Japan to the United States, like I think that one of the biggest culture shock was, the religion and how people look at their life based on their, I guess, religions. But so like how Buddhism exists in Japan in a society, and how I guess Christianity exists in the United States are completely different because, again, Dr. Vessey, how you said it, like a lot of Japanese people don't look at it as, I guess, religion, or, when you ask people, like even myself, I don't say I practice Buddhism, but a lot of things that, you already mentioned during this session, I think, I agree. And I feel like I'm doing it in my daily life. I guess the question is like, how do you look at it, the different, like, the structure of religion in different society, and then your perspective coming from the United States to Japan, because my perspective is from Japan to here, and then I'm here. So I'm wondering if there's a difference.
Okay. I mean, there certainly were periods in Japanese history where, well, first of all, let's when we think about religion, we should be aware that religion is a modern construct, right? Religion versus secular, right? Before the Enlightenment in Europe, certain thinkers in late Edo period in Japan, that distinction didn't exist, right? Your belief in something was integral to your worldview, and you didn't think in terms of you can live a daily life without having the religious part. No, that's not the way people thought. So there were certain times in Japanese history, particularly roughly when this building was built, that there were groups of believers who were quite fervent, and that fervence sometimes led to outbreaks of violence. That's what happened. The city of Kyoto was destroyed in 1466 by warriors fighting, but afterwards different groups of Buddhist believers also got involved in the struggle. It wasn't just religious. It's kind of like the 30 Years' War. Well, it sort of begins between Protestants and Catholics, but a lot of other things start to come into it. A lot of other geopolitical considerations come in. That's also there in Japan as well. But in earlier periods, Buddhism or religion was more in the forefront of how people thought. In modern Japan, that would be, say, that's actually a stronger presence in the people who believe in, say, a Soka Gakkai. In America, Soka Gakkai is also there. There are certain Soka Gakkai is a lay movement that's based upon a certain kind of Buddhist teaching that originated in Japan. A number of celebrity sorts are believers in Soka Gakkai. There's a university now in Southern California.
Okay.
Those people have a very strong sense of religion in daily life. More traditional kinds of Buddhism, that's kind of represented by this temple here, people don't think about it as much. And that's perhaps why new religions, as they're called, or new religions, have come to the fore, is that people do want to have that in their daily lives. But for most Japanese, kind of like Kay, it's not something they think about every part of their waking hours, but still there are these cultural and sort of religious legacies that are sort of sunk into the culture itself. In the U.S., I think it depends on where you are.
Yes.
I have relatives who live in New York City, and they go to church, but that's not the be all and end all. I have other relatives in other parts of the country, and their religious identity is a lot stronger. And so there are certain parts of the country where it's become the elemental aspect of your life, right? Or do you believe in this kind of Christianity or that kind of Christianity? In Japan, the equivalent again would be people who do new religious practices, but more traditional forms of Buddhism, which are based upon the idea of the cleric who's something of a monastic. That is there, and it informs new religions, but it's not quite as present. But in Japan, if you really push, your beliefs like that, a lot of people kind of, think that, you're intruding now on my space, which you believe in is fine, but don't force your beliefs on me. Would that be a fair way to say it, Kay? I mean, if someone came to you and said you got to believe in one new religion or another, you kind of want to step back, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So you don't get a lot of evangelical Buddhists.
Well, new religions were quite evangelical. They could be quite forceful. This Soka Gakkai did a practice called shakubuku, where they would bring you into an apartment and say, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. They would be quite aggressive about it. Soka Gakkai eventually realized that just breeds a lot of antagonism and resistance, and it's better to listen, talk, be open, don't force, and then people will come to see that you're not threatening, and they become more accepting. So even new religions tend to take a more less aggressive approach to how they deal with the rest of society, because they understand that I'm going to save you gets people saying, back off. I don't.
No, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. No, thank you. Right. Whereas if you're willing to show that you're willing to listen to people, talk to them, acknowledge that they may not follow you, but that's okay, then that gets people willing to accept you.
So I guess kind of like a follow up with that. So would you say, I think here in the United States, some people say the religions or Christianity is more institutionalized in the society. But it sounds like, if I'm hearing you right, I think in Japan's case, it's more like religion has been always there and part of the society, or?
Well, it has, but the concept of institutionalism is interesting. Buddhism up until 1868 was considered, part of the institution. Buddhist temples were used to register people because the samurai didn't want Christianity to spread. After 1868 and the creation of Japanese leaders realized that in order to compete with the modern Western nation state, they needed to have some kind of ideological center that was Japanese. And so what they did was, we haven't talked about much, but there's Shintoism, which is also a belief in local spirits, right? And Buddhism and Shinto had been pretty integrated for about 1,000 years. The Meiji state, the modernizing Japanese nation state, decided that they needed something comparable to what they perceived Christianity to be in Western culture. And so they literally split Buddhism and Shinto apart. They said that the state was going to support Shintoism. Shrines became state shrines, etc. The idea of the emperor as God, well, that's always sort of been there in the past, but people didn't think about it too much. When this temple was built, for example, the emperors lived in near poverty. They had to sell their calligraphy just to survive. But in the modern nation state, this reverence for the emperor was pushed as a means for creating Japanese national identity. Before that, people, again, just like in France, you are from Burgundy, you are from Normandy, you are not French. So the Japanese had the same thing. You were from one part of Japan or another part of Japan. You were not necessarily Japanese. They had to create this Japaneseness because they had, the French, the British, the Americans now knocking on their door saying that, either you open up and trade with us on our terms or we're just going to come attack you. And so as a response to imperialism and colonialism, Japan began to push the Shintoism more. Within the country too, there were internal debates about the relationship between Buddhas and Kami. We won't get into that today because it would take up more than time we have here. So there were internal discussions as well, but Western imperialism sort of pushed that in a certain direction. So as a result, Shintoism became institutionalized. Buddhists accepted this in order to survive. And so up until 1945, there was a strong integration between certain kinds of ritual practices and faith with the state. With the fall of that state in 1945, Japan, kind of like Germany, at 1945, what is it that we are? There's this doubt. And I think that also led to many people in the post-war period to kind of want to step back from institutionalized religion that is complicit in some way with the social structure governed by the state, because it was seen as being, you couldn't trust it. And so I think that's also a part of the reason why people have sort of set Buddhism, institutional Buddhism aside. Another factor is that, going back to that earlier example of the tsunami, if you live in the countryside, these older relationships between the clergy and the laity are still quite strong. I'm sure it's true in parts of Europe too. But many people have moved to the cities in the post-war period looking for work. I don't know where your family is originally from, but a lot of the students at his university, their families are not from the Tokyo area. They initially had lived in other parts of Japan and moved to Tokyo, or they moved to Osaka looking for work. But when they did that, they ended up gradually cutting their ties to these older traditional practices. And so modern urban societies don't have the links to, say, local Buddhist temples that their ancestors would have had back in wherever their home was. So urbanization has also created this separation of identity between the modern Japanese person and then some of these traditions that their families would have believed in other places, which again creates a void that new religions could fill in because they were largely urban based. And so people who came into the cities, they ultimately realized that that this is missing from their lives. They're sort of atomized. They live in apartments but don't know their neighbors. Where do we go? New religions had a sense of modern communities that address those sorts of needs. But again, they were aggressive, and so people also sort of had a certain mistrust of institutionalized religion because of the experiences over the past 150 years about how that's been used to push Japan and Japanese history in certain ways.
Right. So there's a follow-up question on what you've just been talking about from one of our listeners, who this is Alexandria again, who says that she says, Dr. Vessey, you mentioned religious identity. Does Buddhism have a set religious identity? And she follows this up with, I wrote a paper on the Shinto religion of Japan, and I remember that Buddhism contributed to some elements of that belief later on in the belief's history. Is it common and accepted for Buddhism to mix with other beliefs like it did with Shinto? And I think you've been talking about these new religions, but are there other ones as well?
That's a very good question. And in fact, if you look at, again, a temple like this, a Buddhist iconography, the whole depiction of the Buddha as a human, the stories indicate that Siddhartha Gautama was a Buddhist, was a human. Okay. But the whole motivation to depict him as a human actually is a result of Buddhist ideas encountering Hellenic art in what's now Afghanistan, in northern Pakistan, an area that was called Gandhara. And as Buddhism moved throughout Asia, it encountered other religious beliefs like Shinto, like Buddhism, which is in Tibet, other Central Asian religions, etc. So Buddhism doesn't posit an absolute based upon one idea of God. Anything can become seen as a manifestation of Buddhist truths if you're willing to accept it as such. Right. In other words, the Buddhist truth can assume a myriad of forms. And there's a sutra called the Lotus Sutra, which was very prominent in East Asian Buddhism. And there are 28 chapters. The first 14 chapters contain a number of stories about how Buddhists adjusted their teachings to suit those who are listening.
Right.
And so, if you encounter someone who has a different belief system, say they believe in yashas, which are like deities who live in trees and they could be malevolent. Well, rather than just saying they don't exist, Buddhists would say, yeah, they exist, but we've preached to them. They realize that they can attain awakening themselves, and they become protector deities. So if you go to a Buddhist temple now in Japan, you'll see these two guardian figures who are human-like, but they're not quite human. They have muscle structures that no human being would have. But
we just tell ourselves that.
Yeah, exactly. But they would have been deities in another belief system, a localized religious system, who have been converted, and they become protectors. And in the case of Shinto, when Buddhism came in, initially those who believed in these kami were resistant. Gradually, it became, as Buddhism also had state support at this time, it became more prevalent. They developed a system, though, where the kami, the local spirits, became protector deities, but then it was pushed even further to where certain Buddhist priests were arguing that kami, these local gods and spirits, were actually just localized manifestations of these more absolute Buddhist ideals. And so the biggest example would be Amaterasu, who is the sun goddess, she's the sort of progenitor of the imperial household. She, in fact, was a manifestation of a Buddha who is known as Vairochana, Dainichi in Japanese, who represents the fact that all of existence, in fact, is not different from the Buddha. It's a sort of statue. It's an effort to use iconography to represent a Buddhist universal principle. And so this the sun god, goddess, is thus seen as being a local avatar of Buddhism. So this idea of avatars is integral to the way that Buddhism interacts with other religions. And so if you go to Thailand, if you go to Laos, you'll find spirit houses in front of human homes. Those spirits are not necessarily Buddhist, but Buddhism coexists with these because they're just seen Even if you believe that there's an actual spirit in the house, that's just another life form that's trying to make it through existence, and we're going to help too. And so
Yeah.
Buddhism is able to take these things in without actively suppressing them.
Right.
And so hybridity is not necessarily a problem for Buddhism in that sense, because it could be accepting. Now, that having been said, when you look at recent events in Myanmar,
Yeah.
where the Rohingya people who are Muslims,
Mhm.
Buddhism can be closely integral to nationalist identity.
Mhm.
And in that case, then this whole idea of hybridity doesn't cut it. we don't want that.
Yeah.
So again, there are the ideals, and then there's the actual human practices. They don't always match. But in terms of Japan, this idea of the avatar allowed Buddhism and Shinto to interact. Getting back to my earlier point, though, when the nation state creators wanted to create a unique Japanese identity, well, we can't have this avatar stuff anymore. So they have to be separated. And certain Shinto thinkers actually, centuries before, began to say, no, the order is backwards. It was the Japanese gods that were first, and the Buddhists were just avatars of these ideals in India, and they've just come
Right.
home to us. So there are these structures that allow integration between seemingly different belief systems, because at least in the case of Buddhism, there's no single absolute deity that's distinct from other things,
Right.
and that
So
allows. Go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, if I could ask a follow-up question on that, and please forgive me if I'm sounding silly, but this is something I've
No.
really,
Uh-huh.
it's just you're mentioning avatars for Buddha, and
Right.
whenever I see Buddha represented, just kind of like if I'm looking on Google Images, or like my grandma has a statue from when she lived in East Asia as a tourist, it's always kind of a chubby guy. There's this kind of recognizable figure of a guy in robes who's got kind of a belly and a bald head.
Oh, okay.
So where did that symbol of Buddhism or the Buddha come from, since it sounds like so many things could represent that or be an avatar for it?
That is Hote. That's his Japanese name in Japanese. And I think he's an avatar of again, Dainichi. I'd have to go look that one up. But that's a Chinese sort of interpretation of Buddhism. The pudginess part, where does that come from? I mean, for me, it's just because I eat too much. But in China in particular, pudges, this is, again, where society comes into these things, cultural backgrounds. In China, pudginess reflected a certain prosperity. And the same in Europe, right? I mean, being heavy set meant that you could live well. You have to struggle for every bite of food that you got. And so I think the idea of Hote was adapted to show a certain kind of wealth. Now, there's a physical wealth involved in this, but also a sort of spiritual wealth, right? Stability. He's always happy, etc.
He always does look happy. Yes.
Yes, right. That particular Buddha always looks happy. Now, there are other statues that are pretty fearsome. But Hote is always happy. And in popular faith, that's evolved to the point where, at least in some people in Japan, say if you rub his belly, give you lots of wealth, etc. That sort of element is to it there as well. It's a very sort of open kind of figure, and so it's become. It has been turned into a kind of kitsch, right? I mean, it's sold.
That's why I know about it. Yeah.
Right. This is an interesting case where a religious icon has been turned into a cultural symbol, and then it's sold as a cultural symbol. And it has sort of relationship with Buddhism, but it may be treated more as a local deity almost in certain parts of China and Taiwan, in Japan as well. I mean, you don't think about the Buddhist part too much. It's just this sort of spirit that represents, the the benefits that you get from being a believer. Kind of the way that Santa Claus has very little to do with St. Nicholas, but
Right.
again, he represents what's
And he's got a
presents
belly too.
that's right. He's got a belly too. What's Christmas presents got to do with this, right? But again, it's a part of giving, etc. So it's an interesting example of how in a religion you can have an icon. I actually teach a class on this because I find it interesting how you can take an icon and how it changes and metamorphs into a whole bunch of other things,
Right.
and almost assume a unique identity in and of themselves. And so the background is there if you look for it, but you kind of forget about it too. But that's where Hote comes from. Now,
Okay, thank you. I've always wondered because it doesn't. There's all these descriptions, like you said, of the origins of Buddhism, the kind of origin story you told, and the image I have there is always of a real ascetic, someone who's really skinny and hardly has any flesh at all. But then when you look up Buddha, you see this really chubby guy. So thank you for answering my question.
That's where that comes from. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other figures that are quite fearsome. In Japan, there's a long-standing belief in Fudo Myo, who, in Western iconography, this would be a demon. He has a sword. He has cords. He has these flames behind him. He's got these fangs that are like this. But Fudo Myo is not evil. He's not demonic. He's not Satan. He's in red, but he's not Satan. Rather, he represents a sort of aggressive effort to cut attachments. So these attachments of self-centeredness. So the sword is there not to cut off your head, not to cut off your flesh, but to cut attachments. The cord is there to bind attachments. And so it represents a more sort of proactive response to your suffering. And there are belief systems where if you make offerings to Fudo Myo, he will help you. And so in many temples in Japan now, it's a fairly spectacular ritual. You go write a wish desire on a piece of stick, a stick like that, and then you take it to the temple. And then the priest performs what's known as a gomo. And gomo comes from the old Vedic Homa ritual, where you burnt offerings to the deities. And so you burn these sticks and other offerings. They're given to Fudo Myo in the hopes that Fudo Myo, the priest who performs the ritual, through this ritual becomes one with Fudo Myo. He imbibes the sort of spiritual power and awakening of Fudo Myo. And the priest then, during these rituals, will actually go tap people on the shoulders with his rosaries to remove afflictions from them. So this is a kind of teaching that uses rituals to at least bring people into the Buddhist fold. For many people, this idea of no self, not attachment, that's pretty hard to get a hold of. How do you wrap your mind around that? A ritual like this is something palpable.
Right.
And it ties you to Buddhist teachings, but it's something that you can approach. And so Buddhism allows for this kind of difference because, again, people have different levels of understanding. So Hote too, people may not get turned on by that aesthetic, half-starved image. But someone like, something like Hote, okay, I can deal with that. I can adapt.
Right, big friendly guy.
That's right. And so that it makes it open for people. Yeah.
So if I can kind of bring the conversation kind of back full circle, because I think we just have a few minutes. We were originally going to end at 7:30, but we started at 7:45. So I'm letting us go that long. But
that's fine. That's fine.
If we can bring the conversation back a little bit to where we started with suffering in 2020.
Right.
So how would you say, what would we at Mississippi State, and Kay, maybe you have some thoughts on this too, how should we at Mississippi State, how can we respond to 2020 in a way that's informed by Buddhism? So what can Buddhism tell us or show us or teach us? What can I or my students or my colleagues take from this conversation to help us deal with all the suffering involved this past year?
Okay. I think kind of getting at what Kay was getting at, I don't know if I would say this is the Buddhist way you should do it, but Buddhist practices often center on meditation, reflection, etc. Now, that doesn't mean everybody should go sit in a dark room and meditate, but rather the idea is that you try to step back from yourself. try to, sort of calm the passions. I recently wrote a paper actually on fake news and the impact on us, because people read these things on Facebook without actually looking into the reality of them, or they're verifying them. It incites these passions, and everybody starts getting bent out of shape, right, left. It's created a place where dialogue is no longer possible, right? And getting back to that point I made earlier about the Buddha, who realized that asceticism that leads to destruction of the body is not good because it's too extreme. And I think not so much, let's say a Buddhist, a Buddhist response, but rather, a way to, maybe we really all need to do is sort of step back from all of this sort of discourse and try to listen to each other again. I think you'll find that there are always going to be these people who are so extreme that they won't listen to anybody. But usually, there's benefit in finding people who may be, more conservative than you are, more liberal, but they're also moderate. And, opening up and listening to them again, trying to understand what is it that is driving their views. Okay. I don't know if you know who Graham Norton is.
I do. I love him. I watch
I
little
love you.
YouTube clips of his talk show all the time.
But
tell us who he is for our listeners. Yeah.
He's this British talk show host who does things very differently from the way American talk show hosts work. But anyway, Chris Martin, who is on Coldplay, was on, and this is in 2016, and he comes on. And this is just after the election of 2016. He points out, Chris Martin does, is that, a lot of the reasons people voted that way is because so much of America feels disenfranchised, right? I'm from California, lived in Massachusetts, and let's face it, the whole idea of flyover America is there's a certain debasing there, right? It's like, you guys in the middle don't count.
Hey now.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think we have so much information now, but in some ways it's atomized us so much that we get all this stimulus, but we don't know how to control it. We don't know how to contextualize it. It just creates this angry response. And so I think a Buddhist might say, looking at all this, well, maybe you want to just chill for a bit and reflect a little bit more. What is it that's making you so angry? And then talk to at least people who are like-minded and begin, these sorts of, civil society-like conversations about what is it that makes us different, where's the anger coming from, and how do we find ways of working with each other now. And again, there's always going to be people who will just say no. And there's nothing you can do if they're not going to come, right? Buddhism is about intentionality. So if they don't have any intention of joining the fray, you're not going to get them in there. But if you find other people who are willing to talk, even if they're different, this is a principle of the United States, isn't it? Is that differences talk. They negotiate, they work with each other. We kind of seem to have forgotten that. Media plays into this because, hey, in the case of media, it sells. And media needs to sell because, sadly, news has become business. It's become the sound bite has become an object of consumer, been an object of consumption, right? And so, media industry people, they want to keep their businesses going. They got to keep their stockholders happy, etc. They need to sell this stuff, and so conflict is good for them. It doesn't mean it's good for our society. And so, I think one thing we could learn from sort of Buddhist ideas, without necessarily being Buddhist, is that let's step back, let's start to work with each other again, talk with each other again, and start to find ways of finding similarities that at least allow us to sort of mitigate some of the differences. When I was in the monastery in this would be 1985. We had Catholic priests who would come and sit with us. And part of that was this idea that Buddhists and this is primarily a Catholic activity, would engage each other. Right? They would talk to each other. You know, the traditions are different, etc. But what can you learn from each other, etc. There are other members of the Catholic Church who later told on that say, "Oh no. You know, Catholic priests should never sit Zen meditation." No. So you're going to get people like that. But if you can find people who are willing to talk, and you can engage them without the anger, then you can start to hopefully rebuild things. So I would hope that in Mississippi State and other American institutions, people should learn to talk to each other. Now, that being said, there are certain things like straight out racism. There are certain things that you didn't want to accept, but maybe the question would be well, why does someone feel so threatened by another race?
Right.
Why do you feel so threatened by another group who is different from you? That's the kind of question that will help people sort of work through these sorts of things.
Right. Well, what is driving your anger? What is driving your passion? That strikes me as very helpful questions. That it is that why are you such a moron is not very helpful. But what is driving this anger? Yes, that is a useful, helpful question to get to know someone.
And who is inciting it? Again, when I look at say like Facebook postings from family members, they post things without really investigating, and so. Actually, the paper that I just wrote in peace studies, there's something called peace journalism. And peace journalism's view is that you need to provide information on both sides of a conflict, because usually conflicts exacerbate or grow worse because people are unable to understand what's motivating the other side. And if you can, at an earlier stage, if you can actually engage them in discussions, you can hopefully sort of reach some sort of mutual understanding before the splits become so great that people's pride kicks in. Oh, I don't want to listen anymore. The hell with you guys. You want, if you can get it at an early stage, then you can tone it all down. So part of the discussion I would think would be is how does something like the media, Facebook, Instagram, we now have information that other countries also are using these things, right? How is all of this influencing the way that I am relating to the person sitting next to me?
Right. So it's self-reflection as well.
That's right. Self-reflection. I mean, if you think about it, if you have two people who have opposing political views, they may not see eye to eye if they're literally 2 feet away from each other, but they may feel more connections to somebody who's literally in another state, someone who they've never met before, because, stepping aside here for a second, of this thing.
Oh, the iPhones, yes.
Yeah, and in other words, I mean, I'm sorry, we're sort of stepping away from Buddhism, but this little thing opens us, gives us access to humanity's greatest moments and humanity's greatest hells. You can see anything on this, right? And so I think it's time for us to have a bit of a reflection on, what's this doing to us, right? And that's not Buddhist per se, but this process of introspection, self-reflection, I think should include a discussion of what is this thing to us.
Right. There's a joke that we have in the field of history that if a person from hundreds of years ago discovered that, there's this tiny box that everyone carries in their pocket that can tell you the answer to any question in the world. And what would be the most shocking thing to a person from history about this? And the most shocking thing to them would be that we use this little box we all carry in our pockets to look at videos of cats and argue with strangers.
Yes, exactly. Fighting with someone. I mean, the chat room where you're screaming and yelling at people who you do not know, ever. It's a strange thing, But it's kind of. I'm sorry. This is going to take us beyond sort of the main things. But my roommate in high school actually had a very interesting point that is relevant to this. He said, "Why do people clap when they watch movies?" Well, I mean, because basically all it is a piece of of plastic with colors on
Right.
it that's going past a lighting unit. That's all you're seeing, right? It's just a piece of cellophane with colors on
Yeah.
it. But we forget about that, and then we begin to read into it. And so the thing would be, for us to step back from the moving pictures on the wall a little bit and think about, what's really going on here, et cetera,
Hmm.
and then use that to sort of reconfigure how we might talk to people.
Mm, that's
So
useful.
self-reflection, I think, would be a key thing here.
Okay, so think of where the other person's anger is coming from, what's driving them, and then kind of reflect on how these things are making you respond in a certain way, your own
That's
self.
right. That's right. That's
Right.
right.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. We're at time, and
Okay.
it looks like on Facebook we have a number of not questions so much, but comments as people are just kind of commenting on, like, yes, it's good to think. It's a very progressive idea to think about your differences and how to share them with others and things like that. So I think the conversation is going to continue in our comments. So,
Okay.
Dr.
Okay.
Vessey, let me
It's
thank
been,
you so much
no, it's been a
for
pleasure to talk to
spending
all
this
of you.
time with us, and thank you for sharing this temple with us and explaining Buddhism to us. I certainly feel much calmer now than I did
Oh, that's good. That's
when
good.
things got started.
Hopefully we'll all calm down a little bit after this. So,
Yes, well, yeah, we'll see. But this has all been very helpful.
yes.
Learning about Buddhism, helpful to think about how it interacts with other religions, and helpful to think about we can even apply something from
Okay.
it in our own reactions. So, thank you so much,
It's been
and
very kind of you to make the time for me. Thank you very much.
Thank
you're
you.
welcome. And thank you
Okay.
so much, Kay, for International Education Week. Everyone,
Yes.
keep your eyes up for future events. Okay,
Very good. Very good. Thank you all very much.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.